What are we calling this class again? Intellectual History of the Abrahamic Traditions from Late Antiquity to the 13th Century, okay? At this point, you've been going over some of the very early history of the Abrahamic traditions, right? We know what the Abrahamic traditions are. We're all familiar with this term. We're talking about the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The traditions that claim to trace back in some way to Abraham or Ibrahim of the Bible and the Quran. How about intellectual history when we're talking about the intellectual history of these traditions? We could mean a lot of things by this term. Broadly, it obviously means something like history of thought. There's lots of ways that we could go about talking about the history of thought in these traditions. We could talk about the history of ethics, ethical thought. We could talk about the history of history writing, how histories and memories are constructed within these traditions. We could talk about the history of mysticism, right? What's mysticism supposed to be? Anyone ever encountered this term before? By the way, we do have a microphone here. If you want to participate, answer questions, a microphone can be passed to you. If you have a question, I really don't mind being interrupted. Let me qualify that statement. I don't mind being interrupted with a question. I do mind being interrupted with cell phone rings and that kind of thing, so please make sure they're off. So mysticism, anyone heard of this term before? It's not very important for our purposes today anyways. Mysticism is basically, broadly speaking, any kind of traditions that claim to have or cultivate some kind of direct contact with God. We could compare mystical traditions within these traditions. This class, what we do primarily is we focus on the interaction between the Platonic philosophical tradition and the Abrahamic traditions. So this is what I'll be talking about today. I'll be focusing on these three thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. And I'll be talking about some of their basic thought. We hopefully at this point have read some snippets of their works. And we're basically going over this general background so that we can recognize these ideas of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, when they appear in the text that we're reading throughout the rest of the semester, from Augustine all the way to Dante, okay? So Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus in 50 minutes. That's so easy. I'm going to introduce a fourth guy, Socrates. We can't really talk much about Plato without talking about Socrates. What do we know about Socrates? Has anyone ever read a Platonic dialogue before? Any works of Plato? Okay, I'm sorry, you raised your hand. So you've encountered the name Socrates before? Yes? Okay, can you tell us anything about Socrates? Uh-huh. Okay.
In form of a do I have to?
Go ahead, rock the mic.
So most of his work is written by Plato.
Uh-huh.
And it's written under the form of a dialogue.
Yes.
Where he asks rhetorical questions.
Okay.
And he is to introduce a philosophical notion.
Excellent. So these are all true claims. Socrates, as important as he is to the history of philosophy, he produced no writings of his own. Most of what we know, or what we think we know about Socrates' life and teachings, we know from Plato's dialogues. That is, we know from writings of his most famous and brilliant student, Plato, okay? So Plato writes dialogues, discussions, usually, of different philosophical subjects. They could be topics about ethics, they could be topics about metaphysics, what counts as reality, epistemology, what counts as knowledge. And oftentimes, Socrates is the major figure, the protagonist of these dialogues. He's kind of driving the discussion, okay? Was there a hand up here up front? If he's the creator of Western philosophy, I guess it would depend how you define Western philosophy, but typically we'll say that there were pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus or Parmenides, for example, that come before Socrates that were important. They also influenced Plato, for example. But certainly Socrates is a very important seminal figure. Again, what we think we know about his life, we mostly know from Platonic dialogues. So he tells us that the reason that he took up philosophy, which we can think of broadly as the pursuit of wisdom, whatever wisdom's supposed to be, the reason he took up philosophy basically was a matter of chance or randomness. At least this is the case according to Plato's dialogue, The Apology. So what Socrates claims there is basically he had a friend who went to a place called the Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi was the location of a priestess who allegedly gave prophecies on behalf of the ancient Greek god Apollo. So one of Socrates' friends goes to the oracle. I don't know why he asked this question, but he did. He said to the oracle, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle said, "No one." Okay? So, of course, Socrates' friend's very excited to tell him this. No one is wiser than you. The oracle said so. This is confirmed. But Socrates is confused when he gets this answer because he doesn't think of himself as wise in any respect. He doesn't consider himself to be especially knowledgeable when it comes to the things that interest him. And what he seems to have been especially interested in was ethical questions, okay? So he wants to know, for example, what is the nature of virtue, or what is the nature of courage, or piety, or justice? These are the questions he's interested in knowing about, and he thinks he's basically ignorant. He doesn't have good answers to these questions. So Socrates sets about disproving what the oracle says. He goes around Athens and he starts interviewing all the people who claim to have knowledge, who claim to have wisdom. And again, he's especially interested in these ethical topics, right? So one classic dialogue is Plato's dialogue of Euthyphro, where we can see this kind of Socrates in action. Socrates encounters this priest named Euthyphro who claims to know what piety is. So Socrates is excited. He's very interested. Great, please tell me what piety is. And what Socrates is ultimately hoping to do, he tells us, is he's hoping to disprove the oracle. I'm going to find loads of people who are wiser than I am, and I'm going to show that, no, I'm not the wisest person around. And what he does consistently when he interviews, interrogates, has discourse with these different people, is he asks them what their basic ideas of justice or piety are. So Euthyphro will start to give him his definitions, what he thinks piety is, and Socrates will critically analyze each of these definitions. He'll show why these definitions are inadequate, why they fail to explain all instances of piety. And for Socrates, this is what true knowledge should be. If I have true knowledge of piety, I should be able to provide a definition that can explain every single instance of pious actions, pious objects, etc. It should be a kind of ideal standard that I can use from now on to assess whether or not a certain action is pious. So he's looking for this very strong idea of knowledge, right? This definition that will explain all instances of piety. Euthyphro can't give him this definition, okay? At the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro just becomes frustrated. Every attempt to define piety, Socrates shoots down, he finds problems with, and eventually Euthyphro looks at his watch or sundial or whatever he has on his wrist at this time period, and he says, "You know what, Socrates, I'm out of time, I gotta go," okay? This is the way a lot of the early dialogues of Plato show us when they talk about Socrates. Socrates here is not someone who claims to have any kind of wisdom. If it's true that he's wiser than others, it's only in the sense that he knows that he does not know things. Whereas other people, he claims, think they know things, they pretend to know things, but in fact they don't, all right? So this early Socrates, which we think is a better characterization of the actual Socrates, or at least many scholars think this, is very different than the Socrates we get in the Republic, the excerpts that we read for class, right? There, Socrates is not claiming that he knows nothing. There, Socrates is giving us this very detailed theory about the true nature of reality, this theory of forms. There he has all kinds of knowledge and wisdom that he wants to share with the rest of us, okay? What we think is happening there is we're reading a later dialogue where Plato has developed sophisticated philosophical views, and he's now basically speaking them through Socrates' mouth, okay? But Socrates, in many of these early dialogues, again, he doesn't portray himself as the purveyor of wisdom. Instead, when he describes himself as a kind of midwife of ideas, okay? And if you look at the handout, there's a nice passage from the Theaetetus where Socrates explains what he means by this. He's comparing his kind of midwifery, that is bringing about ideas, to the practice of actual midwives who help deliver babies, right? He says, "My art of midwifery is in most respects like theirs, i.e. midwives, but differs in that I attend to men, not women, and look after their souls when they are in labor and not after their bodies. The triumph of my art is thoroughly examining whether the thought which the mind of the young man brings forth is a false idol or a noble and true birth. And, like the midwives, I am barren. And the reproach which is often made against me, that I ask questions of others and have not the wit to answer them myself, is very just. The reason is, the God compels me to be a midwife, but does not allow me to bring forth. And therefore I am not myself at all wise, nor have I anything to show, which is the invention or birth of my own soul. But those who converse with me profit. Okay? So the way Socrates viewed himself and the way Socrates' friends, followers, students, people like Plato view this Socrates in his career is a kind of midwife of ideas. He's helping others to arrive at better ideas. So maybe once Euthyphro is done talking to Socrates, he learns that what he thought was piety is not in fact a good definition of piety. Euthyphro's now become confused. He can't explain what piety is. But he's benefited perhaps from this confusion, right? Because now he realizes that there was problems with his understanding of piety, and he's going to go back and, if he wants, try to fix these problems, try to come up with better definitions. This is the way knowledge can expand and grow. But Socrates will say, I myself am barren. I don't have the good ideas to give you. Okay? So Socrates, for those who loved him, was a kind of midwife of ideas. For those who hated him, which, if Plato's right, seems to be the majority of people in Athens, he was not a midwife of great ideas. He was just a public nuisance. He was a supremely annoying guy. He was the guy who would accost you in the middle of the market, start asking you all kinds of questions about justice and piety before you've even had your first coffee. You're trying to give him answers. He shoots down everything you say. You end up getting confused, and then you leave. That's the end of the discussion, okay? No one's benefited. People are confused. They're frustrated. Socrates is extremely annoying. Socrates is extremely hated. He's a public nuisance. And a lot of people saw him this way, and this has a lot to do with Socrates' death, okay, which is being depicted here in this painting. So Socrates in the year 399 is brought to trial in Athens. Do we know what he was accused of? Marwan? Corrupting the youth, okay? In what ways was he corrupting the youth? Do you know? Okay, that's good, exactly. So what Marwan said is he was accused of corrupting the youth and teaching them to disbelieve in the gods of the polis, or the city of Athens, okay? Whether or not Socrates actually did these things is unclear. He certainly is recorded saying things in some Platonic dialogues that are critical of ancient Greek religion. For example, he's critical of the depiction of gods in classic epics like the works of Homer and Hesiod, right? There you see gods as these kind of flawed beings that are willing to fight and murder and commit all kinds of atrocities on behalf of petty jealousies. Socrates will say, this concept, this depiction of gods, it's irrational, it doesn't make sense. If gods are the kinds of beings that deserve our obedience, they need to be absolutely good beings. They can't be beings that arbitrarily harm others or the rest of us, right? So he wants to say, these are just stories. They're not accurate depictions of the god. This is a kind of thing that for some, like Plato, becomes a very influential idea. It's going to change the way that Plato and his followers talk about gods. Gods, they think, should be conceived of as these absolutely good beings, right? But for others, those who want to hold to the ancient tradition of the Greeks, this is a scandalous remark. This is a blameworthy innovation. Socrates is perhaps corrupting the youth, okay? So ultimately, he's found guilty of corrupting the youth, and he is given the death penalty. So you see him here drinking the hemlock. This is the way in which the death penalty was performed, a kind of poison. And I bother to mention Socrates not just because it's important for understanding Plato, but because it already shows us from the very beginning this dynamic relationship between religion and philosophy that we're going to be tracing out throughout the rest of this course, right? From the very beginning, philosophy and religion are joined at the hip. And from the very beginning, the relationship is conflicted. You'll have some, the followers of Socrates, like Plato, who appreciate his insights, and they want to take them up and use them to improve, they think, their concepts of religion. For example, their concept of the deity, right? But you have others who don't see Socrates' way of thinking about gods as any kind of improvement. They simply see it as an aberration from tradition, as a kind of confusion, as something that we don't have good reasons to believe, as a kind of danger, as a kind of threat. And this is a tension that you'll see throughout the works that you read throughout the semester. If we look at the ways, for example, Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd treat the use of religion for the sake of expanding religious knowledge. We'll see very different perspectives on the usefulness of philosophy to this end. Okay? Any questions so far? We good? All right. Plato. So Plato, after Socrates dies, he's totally crestfallen, heartbroken, destroyed. He leaves Athens for a period of about 15 years. He eventually returns to create a school where people can be trained to become philosophers. This is known as the Academy. Aristotle, who you also read parts of his works, Aristotle studied in the Academy under Plato for 20 years. So Aristotle knows as much about Plato as about anyone else. He studied there for the last 20 years of Plato's life. And while Plato was at the Academy, he developed what was known as the theory of forms. And this is the theory that we see being discussed, or at least alluded to, in the snippet of the Republic that we read, which is known as the simile of the cave. Okay? So what Plato is trying to do with the theory of forms is he's trying to explain how it's possible for us to know things. How is it possible for me to know that a clock is round? Or how is it possible for me to know that an act is courageous, for example? Okay? Like Socrates, Plato thinks if I have knowledge of something, I should be able to come up with a kind of definition that explains all instances of that thing. Okay? So if I want to be able to justify the claim that a clock is round, explain that I know what roundness is, I should be able to develop a kind of definition of roundness that applies to all instances of roundness. This is what Plato is ultimately looking for. When we're talking about roundness, when we're talking about properties themselves, blueness, hardness, sweetness, lightness, we're talking about what Plato calls forms, okay? So we can think of forms as properties themselves. Actions will have properties like moral properties. Actions can be courageous or cowardly. Sensible objects in the world will have all kinds of properties, all the features that we can notice about them, right? We can see that things in the world are round. We can see that things in the world are hard or white or pink, okay? All of these various properties are associated with sensible things. And what Plato is looking for is this ideal definition of, for example, roundness, which will explain all instances of round things. So now I have a standard that I can use to judge whether or not a thing is round, because I have this definition that's a kind of paradigm of randomness. Plato will call this kind of definition, this kind of paradigm, a form, okay? But Plato has a difficulty when he's trying to arrive at these definitions, because Plato was not just influenced by Socrates, he was also influenced by other pre-Socratic philosophers. And if you look at the handout here, I point out that one of the most important, and Aristotle tells us this, again, I assume that Aristotle knows a lot more about Plato than the rest of us do, so I think he's a good guide towards understanding Plato's thought. Aristotle tells us that Plato was influenced by the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who taught us that, quote, all sensible things are in a state of flux, and that there is no such thing as knowledge of them, end quote, okay? So now Plato's facing a problem. He's trying to, on the one hand, arrive at these definitions that explain all instances of a property, all instances of courage or roundness or beautifulness, etc. But he also thinks that we can't actually know about the sensible world. When we look at sensible objects like this, Heraclitus will say they're in a state of flux, which means they're always changing. Among other things, it means they're always changing. So, for example, I can look at this coin, which appears to be round, but as it's aging over time, its shape is going to be altered, okay? Moreover, when I look at actual sensible objects, their properties are always relative. They don't have pristine, perfect forms of these properties. So I can think that this coin might be round, right? But relative to other round objects, it will be either more round than them or less round than them, okay? So Plato is trying to figure out how I can come up with this kind of ideal standard that's going to explain all instances of roundness when I can't rely on information that comes from sensible objects. And this is why he develops the theory of the forms. And basically what he argues in the theory of the forms is that reality can be divided into two separate realms or two separate levels, okay? On the one hand, we have apparent reality, what seems to be real. This is the realm of reality that most of us are familiar with on a day-to-day basis, right? The realm of sensible objects, okay? This is the realm of changing sensible objects that exist in space and time, okay? Round clocks, pink donuts, hard coins, etc. We have this level of reality, which appears to be real. Most of us don't doubt that it is real. But if we want to know what is ultimately real, we need to turn to the second level of reality, ultimate reality, which is the realm of unchanging intelligible forms that exist outside of space and time, okay? What Plato wants to argue is that when we're searching for this definition of a property that's going to explain all instances of the properties we see in the world, what we need to be searching for is an ideal object, an object that is going to exist outside of space and time, where it is not going to be relative. So whiteness itself, roundness itself, the form of roundness is an ideal thing that is not going to be relative to other things because it is not limited by the confines of space and time. It is not undergoing any kinds of change. So this is the picture of reality that Plato is trying to introduce us to when he gives us the story of the simile of the cave, okay? The simile of the cave, I don't know if you feel this way. When I read it, it's not exactly clear to me what's going on. I know there's people chained up, but there's a whole lot of stuff, so I think this is a pretty good representation of what Plato has in mind here, right? Okay? So we've got these people in the bottom. These people, we're told, have been chained there from their birth. They're not just chained at the bottom of this cave, but they're chained in such a way that they can't even move their heads to the right or to the left. All they can ever look at, all that they can ever know is the wall in front of them. They can't even see their own bodies. They can't turn their own heads to understand the shapes of their own bodies, okay? So all they see is this wall. Behind them, Plato tells us there's a road running through the cave. Why is there a road running through the cave? I have no idea. I don't know why he came up with this weird torture scenario in his mind. It's like one of the Saw movies. But there's a road going through the cave. There's people walking along this road, and then behind those people is a fire. So everyone who's chained up in the front their whole lives, all that they ever see are the shadows that are projected on the wall. These shadows are coming from the people walking on the road, which the fire projects onto the wall, okay? And what does Plato say about these people? What are they going to think of the world when they encounter this lifetime of watching shadows move back and forth? Go ahead. What's that? They'll think that all that there is this shadow realm, right? And they might create sophisticated, maybe we will say, sciences or disciplines to try to explain the forms of the shadows, why the shadows change. Some of the clever ones might get really good at predicting which shadow is coming up next, right? And this person will be praised for his or her knowledge, okay? So they're living in this world where all they know and value is the ability to predict the coming of shadows, and one of them breaks free, he escapes, he walks behind this wall, he sees the people walking on the road, he sees the fire, his eyes are hurt, he can't take the brilliance of the fire. It's like when you walk out into a bathroom when you're in a club and it's all bright inside and you just can't take it, right? It's hurting their eyes. So they're not even sure what they're looking at first. They don't know what these people are. They don't know what this fire is. They have not had any kind of way of learning what these things are. But after spending a fair amount of time with the people in the fire, they start to realize what they had been looking at previously. What they had been looking at previously was simply the shadow made by the fire of these people walking back and forth. And eventually, the escapee is going to not just hang out by where the fire is, but he is going to climb all the way up out of the cave. And when he emerges out of the cave, now he realizes that what he thought was the world, what he thought was real, right, this cave, is just a tiny part of reality. And it hardly goes to explain any parts of this entire world that he's now found. That's all full of different forms of natural life, different villages, and ultimately is going to be governed by what thing? What does Plato assign as the thing that is really going to make the entire world work? The thing that the entire world, we could say, revolves around? The sun, right? Once he learns enough about the world, he'll realize that the passage of time itself, right, the vegetation, all of these things are dependent upon the movements of the sun. Okay? So this is supposed to be a metaphor that's introducing us to this idea of these two separate forms of reality that Plato's introducing in the theory of forms. How's this metaphor supposed to work? So when I talk about the the world of sensible objects, the world of apparent reality, where's this? The shadows. Just the shadows? The cave? Is it the shadows or the cave? The shadows. You sure? Does anyone want to say cave? Where are we going to find the sensible world? The world of sensible objects. What's that? Okay. Well, if you read carefully, Socrates actually kind of decodes the myth for us, or the allegory, okay? So basically, the entire cave is supposed to represent the level of apparent reality, okay? And the people walking here in front of the fire, they're supposed to represent sensible objects, okay? The fire is going to represent the actual sun, not the sun in this allegory, but the sun in the real world. We can see physical objects because of the light produced by the sun, okay? The shadows are going to represent actual shadows of physical objects, okay? So in the realm of apparent reality, we have a bunch of sensible objects, which Plato will say are not fully real because they're always in flux, they're always changing. And we also have illusions produced from these sensible objects. Maybe the shadows that they create, maybe if I dip an object in water and it looks like it's bent, something like that. Early on, these people are living in the lowest of the low realms, like the illusions of the sensible world. When he marches up to the flame, now he's entered the equivalent of our full embodied experience of the sensible world. He sees the actual sensible objects. He realizes that the shadows are just cast off of them. But it's when he leaves the cave that he's now entering the world of the ideal. This is the world of ideal forms. When he grasps the immensity of this world, he recognizes how insignificant the realm of sensible objects is, okay? And the sun, which I'm talking about the metaphorical sun now, the metaphorical sun in this allegory is supposed to represent what in the realm of ideal forms? What's that? In a sense, we could say this, but Plato gives it a much more specific name. Not truth. What's that? Deities? Nope. Goodness, okay? He's going to say that the most important of the forms, right, the one that sets the standards of truth and intelligibility for all forms is going to be the form of goodness, okay? This is one of the few dialogues where he makes this claim, and even if you pay attention, Socrates is speaking here, right? Socrates is emoting or giving us Plato's opinions. Socrates says, in my opinion, the sun is represented by the good for what's that's worth. So Plato's not entirely sure, it seems, how important it is to raise the good above other forms. But this is the idea that he's working with at this point, okay? That's something worth remembering, because when we talk about Neoplatonian thought, he's going to identify ultimate reality with the good. This will be one of the precedents that he cites when he explains why, okay? So this is the general metaphor, the allegory, the simile that Plato's working with to try to introduce the theory of forms. And we could say lots of other interesting things about Plato. These are the things that you'll talk about in your smaller groups. I have not too much time, so I want to move on to Aristotle. But one last thing we need to mention with Plato is Plato did have a problem when he wanted to say real knowledge lies in this ideal realm of perfect forms, non-changing, non-sensible, non-material, timeless things. The problem is, if I want knowledge, and I happen to be in a body, in a world of change and matter and time, how am I ever going to learn of these forms, right? How can I come to know these forms if I'm searching for knowledge? Is it impossible? Plato needs to explain how we can come to know these kinds of forms. And he develops this idea of the immortality of the soul. And basically the idea is, Plato argues that we are all souls that are trapped in bodies in this life. Our souls are immortal, and our souls are immaterial. And prior to this life, our souls were among the forms in this ideal realm. When our souls were put back into our bodies, right, we now live in the world of material things bumping up against three-dimensional objects, and we can recognize properties in these objects, like roundness or hardness or anything else, because when we see these objects, it triggers a memory. It triggers a kind of memory of the forms that we were once familiar with. So the way Plato understands the quest for knowledge, the search for knowledge, is basically slowly unpacking these memories that we only have dimly at first, right? Until we can finally arrive at a complete definition that will explain a property in every case. When we've done that, we've fully recollected our original understanding, our original knowledge of the form, okay? So these are ideas that we're going to see other thinkers throughout the semester working with. When you start reading Augustine, you're going to see that he drank deeply from the well of Platonism, and the distinction between the ideal and the sensible or material world is going to be very important for him. He also is going to take the material world as somehow less real, less fully good than the ideal realm, which is where he's going to place God. Aristotle, we should talk a little bit about him now. This is a portion of Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, which depicts Plato next to Aristotle. Plato's supposed to be on the left. Aristotle's supposed to be on the right. And I give you this image. It's one that's popularly given in this kind of setting because Raphael here is portraying very succinctly a kind of classic difference between Plato and Aristotle. We see Plato, he's pointing upwards, okay? This is supposed to represent pointing towards the realm of the ideal forms. Okay, this is where he's going to find truth. This is where he's going to find knowledge. Whereas Aristotle, he has his hand like this, facing downward. So Aristotle, much more than Plato, was especially interested in studies of the natural world. He spent long periods of time studying animals, and he didn't accept Plato's premise that it's impossible for us to know the sensible world. Okay? So this led Aristotle to ultimately reject Plato's separation of forms from sensible objects. Aristotle thought that we don't have good reasons to posit this ideal realm of forms that exists, that is separate from the sensible world. Aristotle thought we can totally explain where we get these concepts of roundness or beautifulness or anything else just from our experience of everyday sensible objects. So what happens is I see a number of roundish things, I see donuts, I see clocks, I see signs, etc. And after a while, I start to recognize a pattern, right? Once I recognize this pattern, I generalize it as a concept, and now I have a kind of concept that helps me to recognize other types of roundish things. I can explain where my idea of roundish came from without positing this realm of ideal forms. So I can gain knowledge from the sensible world. And Aristotle thought that if we're going to gain knowledge from the sensible world, what we need to be able to do, what counts as knowledge, is to explain the causes of a thing. I need to be able to explain why a thing is the way it is. So what is its cause? If I have this kind of knowledge, this is the principal knowledge I need to understand what that thing is. And Aristotle thought that when I'm talking about the cause of a thing, I really should make that plural. There's really 4 different types of causes of things. And this is what Aristotle discusses in passages of the metaphysics and the physics that we read for this class. So he says, given any kind of object, we can talk about 4 different ways in which that thing is what it is, okay? On the one hand, we can talk about the material cause, all right? So the material cause of an object is basically that out of which something is made. This is Aristotle's language here. That out of which something is made, all right? So if we take an object like this statue here, a statue of Aristotle, that out of which it is made, the material cause of the statue would be what? I'm not exactly sure. Looks like it's marble, okay? So if I want to explain why this statue is what it is, one of the things I'm going to have to do is explain what material it came from. This will explain, for example, why it's hard. This will explain, for example, why it's white, because marble has these properties, okay? I also am going to want to explain the formal cause. Aristotle defined the formal cause as what something is to be, what something is to be or what something is to become. So I want to explain why this statue is the way it is. The statue happens to be a representation of Aristotle. Why does it have this form, right? Well, because some sculptor wanted to make a sculpture of Aristotle. This was the sculptor's aim, right? This is why it happens to have this form. This is why this chunk of marble came to have this shape. So here I'm talking about the formal cause of this thing. We also can talk about the efficient cause. And Aristotle's idea of efficient cause more closely resemble what you or I mean when we say cause on a day-to-day basis, right? By efficient cause, Aristotle meant the primary source of change for a thing. The primary source of change for a thing. So what is it that transformed this chunk of marble into this statue, okay? Obviously, we would look to the sculpture. This would be one example of part of the efficient cause. Maybe we would also want to talk about the craft of sculpting. This would be another part of the efficient cause of this statue. And lastly, the final cause. For final cause, Aristotle would say, that for which a thing is made is the final cause. That for which a thing is made. So if I want to explain why this statue is the way it is, I want to also address this question. Why was it made this way? Okay? There could be different answers for this. Maybe somebody wanted to remember make sure that people remembered what Aristotle looked like, memorialize Aristotle, honor Aristotle, something like this, right? This would help explain why it took this final shape, okay? I think when we talk about artifacts, things that human beings make, it's pretty easy to plug in these four causes and figure out what the answers might be. It might be a little harder with natural objects. If we're going to take something like maybe an acorn, okay? Acorns are going to grow up to become oak trees. How would Aristotle explain the four causes of an oak tree? Well, first of all, we would want to talk about the material cause. We would look at the actual stuff that an acorn is made of, different kinds of minerals and proteins, etc. The tree grows out of this stuff. We'd want to look at the formal cause. The formal cause is what this acorn is supposed to be, or what it is to become. We know that acorns grow into oak trees. This is not a random thing. You don't plant some acorns and they become corn husks or automobiles or something like this, right? They are meant to become oak trees. So this is going to explain why it transforms into the oak tree. When we're talking about the efficient cause, what would be the efficient causes to explain how the acorn becomes an oak tree? Any ideas? So the efficient cause is what actually causes the change in a thing. Yeah? Well, reproduction wouldn't explain why this seed, this acorn, became the tree. What are the actual things in play that are forcing it to change? Yes? Germination, okay. Soil, sunlight, water. These would all be parts of the explanation of efficient cause. What caused this bundle of proteins and minerals to branch out into what we now see as an oak tree, okay? And lastly, the final cause, okay? And here, what's your name in the black you just spoke? Yeah, David, okay? Here, when we're talking about final cause, we're getting to what you just said. You said that reproduction is something that we want to consider. You might think when you're looking at a natural object that, unlike an artifact, it's not made for a certain purpose. But that's not the way Aristotle thought about it. When he looked at an acorn, he said it's significant that it's not random, that they always become oak trees. Okay, this is what they are meant to be. And what is the final cause? Why? What is the purpose for this acorn becoming an oak tree? He would say the purposes would be the flourishing of the tree and the reproduction of more oak trees, right? This would be the final cause, okay? So these are ideas that we'll see also coming up in other places throughout the semester. One controversy will be, can we talk about God as a kind of object that has these types of causes? Another thing that Aristotle thought, believing that we can gain knowledge from the sensible world, is he thought that he could argue on the basis of sensible objects for the existence of God. So he provides us with different arguments for the existence of God on the basis of what we observe in the sensible world. For example, he says, I see that sensible things move, and I know that if something moves, it must have been moved by a previous mover. Likewise, I know that that moving thing must have been moved by a previous mover. But I also know that that chain of movement, it can't go back infinitely, because if it did, movement would never start, right? An infinite chain has no beginning. Yet I know there is movement, I see it in the world. So that means there must be some first unmoved mover, something that set the chain of movement in motion that doesn't itself move, and Aristotle posits that this is God, okay? When you read Thomas Aquinas, you'll see him lift this entire argument among others from Aristotle, okay? Philosopher who trusts the world of sensible objects as a basis for knowledge. So the last figure that we read and that I want to discuss today is Plotinus. I don't know if you've read Plotinus. I don't know if you've read any of the readings. But if you do read Plotinus, you will find him, I think, to be extremely difficult, absolutely torturous, borderline nonsensical. It's very rough stuff. You're not the first people to think this. You're not going to be the last. You could read him for decades, and it's still going to be very rough going. And personally, I've never been in a state where I'm reading Plotinus and I am confident that I have the correct understanding. This is perhaps one of the reasons why he's so influential, though, because his language, the obscurity of it makes it very rich for different kinds of interpretations, right? Inspiring different kinds of ideas. He's remembered today as the founder of Neoplatonism, a new kind of Platonism, but he and his followers didn't think of themselves this way. They just thought of themselves as good old-fashioned Platonists. This term Neoplatonism is a product of the 19th century. Historians of philosophy in the 19th century started to realize that Plotinus basically took Plato's thought in new directions that Plato would never have imagined, and that a Platonist doesn't necessarily have to go. So they created a new term for the Plotinus form of Platonism. But again, Plotinus didn't think he was doing anything new. He thought he was doing something old. He thought he was being faithful to Plato's ideas. And I gave you a passage here on the handout of how Plotinus thought of his own Platonism. He says, quote, "What we say represents no novelty, and was said not now, but long ago, though in inexplicit fashion." So I'm not saying anything new. I'm just saying the things that were said long ago, but they weren't said explicitly. What Plotinus thought he was doing is he was making Plato's ideas explicit. He was expanding upon them, clarifying them, finishing the parts that Plato never got a chance to finish. Our present exposition is merely an exegesis of what was then said, and relies for its proof of antiquity on the writings of Plato itself, okay? He says he's doing exegesis here. Exegesis means interpretation. And he says, how are we going to justify this interpretation? We're going to show that it's faithful to Plato's actual texts, okay? So he very much imagines himself firmly in line with the Platonic tradition. This is worth noting because St. Augustine is reading Plotinus, okay? And when we read St. Augustine, we'll see him talking about his reading of the Platonists and how profound and important they were for his transformation and how he thought about the nature of God. When he's talking about Platonists, he's also thinking of Plotinus here, okay? This is why it's worth noting that Plotinus, his followers, people of many generations after, they just thought of him as a Platonist. So the idea that he introduces is the idea of the One. This is a kind of mysterious being. Plotinus himself tells us that this idea is in some sense beyond thought, so we should have a very difficult time understanding this. Basically, the One is an encapsulation of not just all reality, but even non-being. Plotinus develops a kind of monistic view of reality, where all that exists is one thing. And he posited that all being derives from this One, which he also identified as the good. So following Plato in the Republic here, he's identifying the good with the source of all intelligibility, the source of all forms, the source of all life, of all reality, okay? This One is the source of all that exists. So like Plato, again, he's taking the good as the primary source of all things, but unlike Plato, Plotinus argued that the One, or the good, in some sense, it needs to transcend being. It needs to also, he says, include non-being. Why? It's kind of a torturous argument, but his argument is the One is supposed to be the source of all things. okay? If we want to understand reality, we need to break it down to its most basic parts. And the most basic part can only be the principle from which all things emerge. But if this is supposed to be the source of all being, then it can't itself simply be a being. It can't simply exist. Why? Because then it wouldn't be the source of all being. How could it be when it already exists? This is the way he's trying to think here, right? If we're trying to get to the source of all being, we must be talking about something that, in a sense, is not being. Some people talk about the one as pure potentiality here, okay? So Plotinus' concept of the one, it's especially difficult to grasp. I look forward to hearing what your teachers say about it as you're trying to figure out what the hell Plotinus is talking about. But one thing that we should notice is many different thinkers that we're looking at throughout the semester, they're going to be influenced by this idea, as difficult as it might be. So we'll see practitioners of the Abrahamic traditions use a similar account to explain why God, the creator of all things, is not like the things that God creates. Okay, they're going to use a similar kind of argument here. And we're also going to see some thinkers like Maimonides go so far as to say that we can't say anything positive about God. We can only say what God is not. And why he's saying this is for similar reasons to what Plotinus is saying. In a sense, when we're getting to this ultimate principle of reality, it's beyond thought, it's beyond language, okay? So again, we're just scratching the surface on all of these thinkers. For those of you who've read them before, probably a lot was familiar. For those of you who haven't, hopefully you've got some basic nuts and bolts to sort of work with as you encounter these ideas throughout the rest of the semester, okay? Thanks so much for your attention, and have a great semester.